But basically what we wanted to provide is an opportunity for people to ask us more questions about biological evolution, or even some of the topics that Joseph talked about. He may be coming down to join us in a minute. Again, welcome to the Darwin Day activities. Let's just first introduce ourselves, who we are. Bill, you want to start?
Okay, I'm Bill Duncan.
You want to speak here?
Yes, I'm Bill Duncan, and I am a professor in sociology and anthropology. I teach the human evolution courses at ETSU. I'm actually a bioarchaeologist. I study human remains from archaeological sites, but I teach the human evolution and anthropology.
I'm Steve Wallace. I'm a professor in geosciences, and really what I like to focus on is sort of my research out here. I'm site manager, so I do a lot of digging out here, and I'm a curator as well.
And I'm Blaine Schubert. I'm also in the Department of Geosciences. I am also the director here at the Natural History Museum. Also a paleontologist. In particular, I work on things like fossil bears and fossil alligators.
I'm Jim Mead. I'm chair of geosciences at ETSU, and I'm also a curator out here. I'm a paleontologist, have been for 40 years now, I guess, and mainly work now on fossil lizards and snakes.
Well, I thought what we would do is start with the topic of human evolution, because that is something that people like to hear about and like to talk about. We have a table out in the entry area about human evolution. But one of the things that we often hear with human evolution is that there are not a lot of transitional forms, or with any aspect of evolution. So maybe, Bill, you could start by just sort of talking about human evolution and the fact that you teach evolution and how that goes.
Okay. I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
In terms of transitional forms,
Right.
things like that. Well, you can see, first of all, I would say, a lot of times you don't see transitional forms, and the absence of transitional forms is a meaningful data point for people who are studying evolution. That means it's not, it's not a uniform thing. It's always happening in one direction, or at the same rate, or in the same mode. So that's certainly true. But when you look at the hominid fossil record, you do see intermediate stages. If you just look at hominids, say in the last 8 million years, and you're looking at cranial capacity, you do see a gradual transition. If you go look at the table out there, actually the Anthropology Club is doing that. One of the activities is, can you put these in order? And without knowing anything about the fossils, you can do that just based on the fact that you see cranial capacity increase through time, and so you see this sort of transition. One of the things you'll also note if you see one of the figures they have out there is that the rate of increase is not uniform. At 2.5 million years ago, you see cranial capacity start to get bigger faster. And the reason you see that then is it's associated with the manufacturing of stone tools, which happens right around 2.5 million years ago. And so I think there's, you can see some transitions going on for whatever feature you happen to talk about. Some things that happen very quickly, and an example of that would be bipedalism. There's not an awful lot of real comfortable postures between being a quadruped and being a biped. You got knuckle walking, but that wasn't something that we did in terms of our ancestors. That was something that seems to be specialized for apes.
How do you know when you look at a fossil that animal is actually standing up? I mean, how do you know that they're not, on all fours, like say a macaque or something like that?
Yeah, there's several ways. Your body goes through a lot of different changes if you're a biped. One of them is, if you look at the skull, the hole in the bottom of the skull where your spinal cord connects to your brain is up underneath the center of this big globular skull that we have, because we have real big brains. Your pelvis is very, very different. If you look at our pelvis, it's more bowl-shaped. If you look at a chimpanzee, for example, they have these really big iliac crests, these bones that come up your back that are at the top part of your pelvis, because they're not supporting they're not holding all of your gut space. And also, if you look at your toes, one of the things you'll notice is your thumb sticks out the side. It's divergent. And if you look at a lot of primates, non-human primates, they also have divergent big toes. But we use our big toe to push off. That's one of the last parts of a biped stride. And so that's one of the things that those are some of the things you can do to tell that you're looking at an actual biped.
So it's not too hard to tell that really kind of all of a sudden appeared almost very quickly geologically.
It was not a Yeah, that's something you can actually pretty much tell. It seems to have happened around. It got refined over a long period of time. Our bipedalism is not the same as a Homo erectus bipedalism exactly, but you got to being the transition from spending most of your time in the trees and then you went to sort of what's called facultative bipedalism, which meant that when you came down out of the trees, you would have been kind of in this scrambling posture, maybe a little bit upright, and then actually to an obligatory biped, which you were really walking around, upright. That happened relatively quickly, when you compare it to, say, the transition to having a large brain.
I think if we step back for a minute and sort of look at much of the general public's perception, and also with the way the media likes to portray this as, well, they haven't found the missing link yet, right? And that whole concept of not being able to find the missing link. But in fact, every fossil that we find is a link. It's not necessarily a link in our direct ancestry, but it is a link. And I think with human evolution, what we have to think about is not this direct progression from one form to another, like our poster sort of showed, but is this branchiness that when we find these fossils, it doesn't necessarily mean it's our direct ancestor, but what we see in the fossil record are trends in time, the trend of development of bipedalism, and not every hominid in the past that was bipedal is necessarily our ancestor.
That's definitely true. You see the same thing happening with dental changes, bipedalism, that's certainly true. Big brains, or a lot of big brain things that didn't wind up leading automatically to being modern humans. Definitely not one. That's certainly true.
Are there questions from the public about human evolution, the human evolution fossil record? I have lots. I mean, one of the exciting things to think of too when we look at human evolution is the fact that there were many times in our past, in our history, where there was more than one upright walking hominid, where there were actually other species. We don't get to experience that today, but if we go back 2 million years ago, there were instances where there was overlap of very different types of hominids.
Yeah, even 100,000 years ago, there would have been multiple. You would have had some modern humans would have been walking around. You would have had Neanderthals walking around. There would have been some archaic forms that would have been somewhere in between, I guess you could think, in terms of the way they might have looked between humans and Neanderthals. There would have been these small little guys over on an island in Indonesia that you may have heard of called hobbits, and they would have been running around also. And so that would have been just 100,000 years ago. And that, I always ask my students that actually, would it really, those hobbits could have been around very recently, like 20,000 years ago or something like that. Would it change your view of your place in nature if there were other hominids running around? What does that make you, think about? How does that make you feel? And the answer for them is this on the test? That's what they want. But that notwithstanding, I think it's an interesting, that's an interesting sort of philosophical thing.
How do you know when you say human, we all have this image of us, but at what point do you say some of these fossils are human? Like the Flores Island.
Yeah.
Little folks that unfortunately are about my size.
Right.
But,
Yeah, that's a really good question, and most people seem to think modern humans came around sometime after 200,000 years ago, closer to 150,000 years ago. And then, but what makes us human? It was a gradual transition there, right around that time, and there's no clear delineation between that. When you think of it depends on who you ask. Also, different time, through time, people have used different traits to define what it was to be human. For a long time, it was having a big brain. In fact, there was a famous forgery of some fossils, the Piltdown forgery, where people tried to make things based on these sort of ape-like jaws, but also having a modern human brain. And that was something that people sort of thought was how the narrative ought to go. Other people, looked at stone tools and tried to define humanity on the basis of making tools, manufacturing tools, and so those are the things that people use to try to sort of define those. People have always tried to define some line or some criterion that could be used to say, okay, we're in the fence and they're out of the fence, or vice versa, however you want to think about it. And that's and those are some of those criteria.
Yeah.
So have we sequenced any species that are closely related, like Neanderthal and things like that? Have they sequenced the DNA of any of those
Yes, they have.
species?
They've gotten the mitochondrial and nuclear DNA from Neanderthals. And recently from an archaic form over in Asia, they've been able to get some DNA from. And
Denisovans?
yeah, that's correct. And so, yes, they've been able to do that. And people have started to, on the basis of that, push back some of the dates to when we had our most recent common ancestor with Neanderthals. It's closer to, 500, 600,000 years ago is when this divergence time could have, maybe could have happened with modern humans. Which is interesting because Neanderthals were around, a lot more recently than that. And so it seems to be they went up into Europe a long time ago, and it was sort of this cul-de-sac, and they kept evolving in that cul-de-sac. And they were also kind of think of them as being cold filtered. That's how you can think of the Neanderthals, because they were selected for all these cold adaptations in this cul-de-sac. So that was
Like Wally, for instance.
Yeah.
I don't work with these guys. I'm not going to say that.
So that implies that Neanderthal is not our direct ancestor.
They were definitely not our direct ancestor. There was probably a certain amount of interbreeding. And the $64,000 question is how much interbreeding is going on. I don't think anybody's really satisfied with that.
What they're finding is that most people that they test with European ancestry have a smidgen of Neanderthal in them.
That's true, and there's some things they're finding out, like some specific things they found out, like Neanderthals maybe they would have had red hair, things like that. Some of them would have had red hair, which is kind of interesting because that's not when you think of a Neanderthal in your mind, most of us don't think of little orphan Andy running around, right? Nobody thinks of that. So there's, it's real interesting. Those are some of the things they found.
I think the whole Neanderthal story is really interesting too, because originally that whole caveman persona developed because of the discovery of Neanderthals and of them being stupid, dumb cave people. And in fact, that probably couldn't be farther from the truth. Very well adapted to their environment, actually having a brain size in some cases on average larger
Than ours. It was also a really hard place to live where they were trying to conduct business. It was a hard job being a Neanderthal. Like it was back in you were talking about the ice ages. It was very cold at that point in Europe, and somebody actually went and they looked at the modern profession that had injury patterns most similar to Neanderthals, and it was a rodeo clown. That was actually
I was going to say, I've actually heard rodeo and also football players.
Right, yeah, they really got beat up, and it was a hard place to do business.
I mean, part of that because they didn't have things like bow and arrows, and therefore they're using spears and killing those rhinos at close contact.
As was say, my understanding was it's because of close contact with large animals.
Yeah, you're going to kill a woolly rhino using a Swiss Army knife.
Yeah, you
got some Swiss Army knife and a pop gun. You got a problem, right? And so that was a challenge. But they were still using some cultural things, herding things off cliffs if possible, or into tar pits or whatever less or less mobile, but sending them into the forest or things like that.
Sure.
But it's still somebody's got to be the one to get in there and try to strike the first blow. That's you don't want to get that short straw, right? And so that was a challenge. Yeah.
I've read that one of the defining characteristics of Homo sapiens, what separates them from other those in the Homo genus, is that they had the advent of culture. But I've also read that all these other variations, all these other prequels, the Homo sapiens also had culture. So how do you think you recognize culture, and when is the advent of culture?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's some people have done it on the basis of language, on the tools, on the manufacture of tools, and there's a lot of different things. And so, we use tools. Everybody says that. That's fine. But like, there's other, chimpanzees use tools, gorillas use tools. If you look at, isn't it otters? They break up.
Say sea otters.
Yeah, sea otters, right? They crack. You know better.
Yeah, I was going to say they'll actually crack open things with rocks, and so yeah, I mean, the use of tools is definitely not unique to us. There are quite a few.
But we had fire at some point. And how's the utilization of fire to our community? At what point does that play out an aspect of, say, culture?
Yeah, that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, you can go to places that are really cold without fire, so that's a good thing. That's where you get to go different places. In terms of, so you can fan out, and there's more places to which you can adapt. Other people have suggested that by cooking food, it enabled us to change our diet significantly. That was one of the things that they have suggested. still a driving force in allowing us to eat more people. That's what some people recently suggested. And they said that was relative or important for increased brain size. So some people speculated about recently. Other people have talked about it in terms of home bases and things like that. If you're coming back to the same cave where you're trying to, there's a social aspect of that. When you start to get back and talking about social aspects and things like that, it's a good way to get clobbered in the literature when you try to impute too much into people's lives. Other scientists try to get up and argue with you a lot about that. But so there's no one line about when culture
I'll
evolved.
chime in on that too. When I was taking my physical anthropology classes and various anthropology classes, I know that one of the things that was used to sort of help define Homo sapiens is art and sort of the abstract aspect of that. So cave paintings, Venus figurines, these sorts of things that we haven't yet seen with Neanderthals, for example. And so it seems to be something that has been able to continually define us as separate. Probably won't always be that way as we look more and more. Culture, though, is different in that there are monkeys and chimpanzees that have culture because what they're doing is they're learning something and then they're passing that on to their offspring and teaching that, and that many people consider that to be a culture.
Yeah, that's true. And it's that in particular associated with humans because you start to see this stuff emerge in Western Europe, in particular all the cave paintings, right when Neanderthals are sort of going downhill. And so it's associated with the people who think we replaced Neanderthals. That was a more popular idea about 15 years ago. And it's still relevant to the debate, it's not as absolute, but the idea that we replaced Neanderthals, art was part of that.
Didn't some of the Neanderthal burials have red ochre hematite on it, which is implying there's still something going on? I don't know if it's quite art. Maybe somebody
There's some
fell
degree of
against the wall and go,
decoration.
oh, that's cool, and then started with art. I have no clue.
It's true, and there's goat horns that have been laid around some Neanderthal burials and things like that. On the other hand, you see some Neanderthal remains that have cut marks that look like they were treated very similarly to animal bodies, like they were butchered. And so for Neanderthals, you see this whole gamut, and also some early archaic forms of these cut marks. So people are saying, is it cannibalism, or are they going to church? It's like this is people sort of constructed a gamut there of the possible range of behavior that they can attribute to Neanderthals. So there could be a lot of, I'm perfectly content with the idea. There's a whole host of things going on. And it's like, if you look at primates, you're talking about, like, there's a famous example of these Japanese macaques, these snow monkeys, that they were giving them rice out on the beach. Okay, and so all these macaques sit around picking up grain at a time. Then there's one bright macaque, the solitary genius of this troop, I guess, picked it up with all the dirt and the rice in her hands, and she walked up to the water and did that, and the dirt sank and the rice floated, and she could eat about a handful. Well, this is a bright monkey, right? And so she taught that to the other members of her troop, but there's whole bunches of troops that are still picking it out of the sand, right? And so
We got that in our society.
right. That's exactly right. And so, that could very well be the case for Neanderthals, this range of behaviors. That is certainly reasonable.
Do you have any measure of the size of populations of various species, at a given time?
There's lots of estimates because nobody knows. That's the reason there's lots of estimates. What does seem to be true is that a couple of important times there's been a relative in human history and hominid history. You guys can answer this probably better. I can estimate breed sizes, leg sizes. There's been some bottlenecks when there was significant sort of constriction of the numbers, and there was a lot less genetic diversity at certain points in hominid history, and we managed to squeak through one way or the other. So it's hard to sort of give absolute numbers, but relatively speaking, there's been some bottleneck that's going on with that.
And they were thinking, 2,000, maybe down to 2,000 people at one bottleneck?
Yeah, and it's like, it was so severe, they actually used cheetahs as a model sometimes. It was apparently, I don't know anything about cheetahs, but they're so similar, they suggest I once heard you could use skin grafts for one cheetah in a while for another cheetah. That's because they're so genetically similar, they won't be rejected. I don't know, is that true?
Basically, my understanding of cheetahs is that they probably came down to a single limb at one time. and somehow came back.
So that's a
And
bottleneck.
yeah, so they have horrible mortality because they're basically all twins.
Right.
They all have the same genetic. And so yeah, they actually, I mean, they are one of the unique examples in nature where something got down to that few and actually survived. That rarely happens.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. So I don't know if we were that extreme, but something like that. I mean, in fact, almost certainly weren't that extreme, but something like that happened in a couple of places.
I mean, one of the things.
When was that bottle? I hadn't heard of that type of bottleneck on humans. I mean, where was that? Still in Africa, or well, we said down to like 2,000?
That's what I understand is
Individuals.
it's Africa.
It is not.
So before we got out.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Was that one of the supposedly exodus from Africa over the millennia? There was 2 or 3 supposedly that came out.
Hypothesis.
Yeah, there was always, we know the modern humans came about earliest in Africa, but there had, since some Homo habilis-like thing and then into Homo erectus, there have been several pulses, 3 or 4 major pulses. One thing it's worth noting, though, that relates to the question of this genetic diversity and bottlenecks is there was also evidence that there was back migration into Africa. We know some actual genetic variants through mutation evolved over, this is with the Denisovans, you can see this, and then there was back migration from Asia. And so there's a lot of things going, it wasn't always going one way. That's actually important for understanding sort of some of this diversity. And it may have been that you can imagine a scenario that you had very low diversity in certain places in Africa, and then got infused with diversity from another hominid that had already left Africa. It could happen in a lot of different ways to sort of bring us back to the cheetah levels of ridiculously high inbreeding.
I mean, one of the things to remember too is that throughout almost all of hominid and Homo sapiens history, we were very small populations. We were very small groups, band level societies, hunting and gathering essentially. And so prior to getting agriculture, we leave a very small, or almost, a mark on the environment that's indistinguishable essentially. And so also the fossil record is very scant because of that. Once you settle down and start farming and living in bigger populations, it becomes much easier to see the impacts. Yeah. Joseph, you want to come up?
Sure.
All right, let's speed over this way.
Sorry, I'm late here.
That's all right.
Yeah.
One of the things that's always gotten me about the fossil record, whether it's humans or not, but especially with humans, is the fact that what is our resource? We're finding, we mentioned the group Denisovan, and that's named after Denisova cave in southern Siberia. Many of our sites are where things actually accumulate in sediments, whether it's inside a cave or, say, right here in Gray. And you kind of wonder how biased a record is that, and how much else was going on, say in the case of humans. I mean, did we always live in caves, or there are a whole bunch of folks that don't like enclosed places, so they live outside in some sort of skin hut or whatever you want to call it. So our record certainly is biased, and that's what makes it so much fun.
Yeah, typically humans like to be high and dry.
Yeah.
And so that sort of limits our fossil record unless we're getting eaten by something else, taken into a cave, which does happen.
Right.
That's most of the fossil deposits in South Africa. That's the way we think they formed. That they were getting eaten in prey items.
My cheetah problem.
What caves down in Africa on the plains?
It's selective. That's where the geology comes in, and that's why, anthropologists right on through, we all have to study some aspect of geology to say, where are we going to find these deposits? And you don't really go to Kansas to find certain deposits, certain ages, because you're just not going to have that. So you find them, you have to select where the geology is. Things like the Great Fossil Site are unique because we didn't even think of that aspect, and yet here's a story. So it means you have to keep looking, and you have to look outside of the box. You have to go where I don't expect to find something, and you might just luck out and find something.
So where's that hominin? Where's that hominin?
Yeah, definitely.
It'd be great if we found hominids here.
Yeah,
I would
we
love
would.
that. It would change the way we look at things.
I have sort of a more general question that will probably just demonstrate how ignorant I am. But the question is, I've been trying, they say the coelacanth, right? So we have fossils of it millions of years ago, and then people will find one. What I'm trying to do is think of how to think about evolution. Like, so the coelacanth has these long fins, but it's a transitional form to something limbed, you know. So, but then, and yet it continues through time, and but its place in evolution seems to be, in evolutionary theory, seems to be that it also launched a series of descendants that then differentiated in different ways. And so I'm just trying to think about that, like in terms of, you know, is it more like a bush instead of a tree evolution, or, you know?
Well, I think actually that is a good way to think about it. Is it is sort of, it isn't linear. You don't go from primitive to advanced. I mean, it is actually.
This is well adapted. It can keep on existing
Sure.
in its niche as is.
It does what it does well, and so it still survives. Why do we have worms today? Why do we have things like that? Because it works.
Right.
It doesn't mean that they can't give rise to something more complicated. It still exists in their own because what they're doing works. And the coelacanth is a really good example because it lives in a very strange environment. It loves to live on these little basically seamounds, the volcanic seamounds, and nothing else really lives there. And so, I mean, they do it well, and so they're still around. And so I think that's the thing to always keep in mind is that textbooks love to show evolution as this straight line. Horses started off small like a cat, and then they got a little bigger, and then they reduced their digits, and they eventually went this large forms. But in reality, if you look at horse evolution, it's incredibly complicated. There's all these different forms existing at the same time. And to give you an example, my master's thesis was on a late Miocene site in western Kansas, and I had 4 different species of horse there. 2 of them were monodactyl, that means they had 1 digit, and 2 of them were tridactyl, they still had 3 digits. And of each pair, there was a small and a large form. So you literally had a variety of horses existing at the exact same time. And so again, just because something appears, quote, primitive, doesn't mean it's not good at what it does. I think that's the way to think about it, is that if it's successful and it can continue to produce offspring, then there's really no reason for it to necessarily change.
Something sort of related to that, a question that I often get answered is if there are still monkeys today or chimpanzees today, how could that be if we came from them? Right? That's a common question. But that is not what paleontologists are trying to say. We're not saying that we came from chimpanzees. We share a common ancestor with chimpanzees at a certain time in the past. And chimpanzees have also changed dramatically since that time as well. They've gone on and had mutations and changed as well. And so we're not like in this sort of progression of change and then you reach humans. There are many, many organisms that basically have changed some or changed dramatically, but it doesn't mean that what we're seeing today is what we came from. Yeah. Lots and lots of branchiness.
Yeah. Well, I think another thing to add to that real quick is just that we always talk about how we're evolving to be better adapted to our environment. The thing we have to remember, though, is that our environment is always changing. And so in reality, we're just trying to keep up. And so don't think of the evolution of life as necessarily this. It keeps getting more and more advanced. Really, it's just running to keep up with the environment.
And those organisms that live in environments that maybe aren't changing very much, they're doing quite well and there's no need to change.
But you also have loss of function too. I mean, that's part of evolution.
Yeah.
If humans don't make vitamin C because we ate vegetable fruit for so long, the body saw no need to generate.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Darwin wrote about is what are called vestigial characters. And those are sort of remnants of our evolutionary ancestors that we still maintain. Horses are an example of what I was talking about. If you look at modern day horses, they still have the vestigial structures of their other toes, some of their other toes, but they don't use them anymore. Some kinds of snakes still maintain legs, and even the little claws on the end around where their pelvis would be. So they don't use those anymore. And what we can see, what somebody might question is, okay, if snakes once had legs, why don't we find that in the fossil record? Well, eventually we did find that in the fossil record. Now we have snakes in the fossil record from the Mesozoic that had legs.
There was a recent book that's just been published on the evolution of feathers, birds in flight. Could you share your information about that a little bit? What was fascinating?
One part would be that, I mean, typically we think of, well, define a bird, and most people would say, well, it has feathers and it can fly. How can it fly? Well, it has feathers, and so there's a little bit catch-22 there. But what we're finding in the fossil record is that feathers and feather-like structures, okay, make the distinction there, we see in a variety of animals. And it looks like that occurred before flying. So then you say, okay, well, let's peel apart the word flight. You can glide a number of animals that can glide well. So we can see a lizard called Draco in Southeast Asia. And it's not really flying. It opens up its arms, and there's an integument in the skin that allows it to glide. We have, quote, flying squirrels that are doing the same thing here in North America. So really, flight is a powered movement, and sustained flight means you have to kind of adapt your we all see swimmers that are really good swimmers. They have a very large chest because they need that in their arm structure. Well, if you're going to do powered flight, it's got to be even more so. So our midline, our chest area here is not built for a sustained flight at all. And when you start looking at animals that can do that, they have, of course, what we see on a chicken, you know, the white meat areas. It's very large mass of muscle. So when you start saying, okay, when do we have powered flight? When do we have true flight? Well, we had feathers long before that. So feathers kind of went along with it. So why did feathers evolve? Or did it evolve for a couple different reasons? That's a whole different story. So does that maybe a little bit answer it? Or?
Did feathers evolve out of scales, would you say? Or is that
Sure, definitely.
They're more or less modified scales.
Yeah. It's like our nail, right?
Yeah.
Form a carrot. So,
Yeah, actually, feathers are a really neat thing for me because in my lifetime, I can remember the first time I taught vertebrate paleontology, I used to say that if you're going to draw a line in the sand between a dinosaur and a bird, you say it's feathers.
yeah.
Because in my lifetime, that was the line. You know, I mean, the first time I taught it, we didn't have feathered dinosaurs. And now that we have found feathered dinosaurs, we're having to redefine where do we draw that line between a dinosaur and a bird, because it is that gray, it is that fuzzy. And there have even been papers recently that have shown, or they've tried to suggest that Archaeopteryx isn't even the first bird, that it is just an advanced dinosaur. And that's kind of neat to me as a paleontologist, that the line is that obscure. And so when I hear people say, where are the transitional forms, I say, are you even looking? Because there's a ton of transitional forms. There are things that we can't figure out, is it a bird or is it a dinosaur? It's right in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, every fossil that we find, every new species that we find is essentially a potential transitional form. And Archaeopteryx is a wonderful one in that you're able to see many reptilian characteristics and many bird characteristics in the same organism. You've got tail vertebrae that continue on out to the end of where the feathers are. In modern birds, they all have a very, very short tail structure. You also have teeth, which are something modern birds don't have, but one of the things we've learned more recently is that birds still maintain the genetics of the teeth, and you can actually mess around with their genetics a little bit, and they will still express those teeth. So it's still there. It's what's called the junk DNA side of things.
Yeah, so I guess one of the problems that we all have is we want to, when we make a decision, we want it this or that. So it's either a bird or it's a dinosaur. But then it gets down into then how to define those things. And it was feathers or flight.
Well, like I said, that was neat for me because the first few times I taught for paleontology, I would say, oh, well, this is the simple line in the sand, is a feather. And I'd say, until we find feathered dinosaurs, this is where it's going to be. And then,
Then somebody,
and then like 2 years later, oh, hey, you can get feathered dinosaurs.
Yeah.
I think that's an important point about, this happens all the time in science, so that a lot of people critically, like you're talking to, try to now criticize evolution. They try to couch evolution in the way it was described about 1930 as Darwinian, or, you know what I mean, or maybe 1859 as Darwinian. But evolution as a science, study of evolution in biology and anthropology and other allied disciplines, it continues to change also. Like, so what we know continues to change through time. That doesn't make it false, right? The fact that we're reevaluating things, that's a good example of the fact that sort of always change.
Well, that's one of the things that makes science different, is that it's okay to be wrong. It's okay, you know, you're continually testing what somebody else previously said, or even what you originally said.
And on a totally separate note, if I could chime in, what you were talking about turning on DNA, if anybody, if you get a chance to go read about that, it is the coolest thing you can possibly imagine. I think that is the most interesting work that's going on right now. It's a side note.
Question?
I was just gonna say, but the public, expects scientists, as smart as they are, to get an answer, and that's it.
And it stays
Right,
that
well,
way.
that's one of the things that we usually get hammered on, is if scientists start arguing, then there's this perception.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just, yeah, the uncertainty of some of those things, the transition between certain forms of knowledge opens the space for somebody to come in and say, well, see, they don't know, and then therefore that's evidence for something else. That's where it opens that space for someone else to kind of jump in there with a different philosophy. But, yeah, of course, I mean, science is always, you know, in progression.
Yeah, well, and we're all skeptics.
Yeah.
I mean, we basically go into everything like that. We doubt everything that people say, and that way, I mean, the beauty of that is that if you go in as a skeptic and someone can convince you of their argument, well, that must be a pretty good argument. And that's just how science progresses.
What I like about some of our master's students, they'll create a thesis and they'll say, well, my thesis is about such and such because I know that this previous person, way back in 1980, said this certain thing, and I know they're wrong now. So that's going to be my thesis. I'm going to show that they're wrong. And we kind of say, now, you're creating a target on yourself. Because in about 20 or 30 years, that target's going to be on your back. And some students are going to go, oh, this person was wrong. So it does show the fact that these things are changing with more data.
Yeah, I think Einstein said something like every year I spend a big portion of my time correcting what I said last year.
Yeah.
Is most of the data from like mitochondrial DNA as far as evolution?
I would assume so, but I don't know.
There's a lot
Because
of
that's like through the mother, right?
Yes, it is. You get a lot of information from that. People use nuclear DNA also, the same way we use fossils. So people are triangulating between a lot of different lines of data to come up. So at least within paleoanthropology, I can only imagine it's true for you guys.
Well, and I think it's going to get better because now that they're mapping entire genomes, it's going to get better because then they're using all the data. Because that is the problem when you use mitochondrial nuclear, you are using just a fragment, but when you map the entire genome, then you actually are looking at the whole thing. And that's becoming more and more data.
So, for example, if we were tracking, we're talking about different waves out of Africa. People
Yeah,
were
about the
tracking.
Neanderthals.
Yeah, but they were tracking that stuff. They were using X specific, X chromosome specific things, Y chromosomes. This is all within modern humans. Mitochondrial DNA. There's a whole host of things that we're trying to look at that were very specific markers, and so they're trying to come from a lot of different areas.
That's where they came up with $7.80, where supposedly all of the hominid knowledge came from 7 different women that they used for the time to go back.
Yeah, that's the idea. That's a little bit harder thing. It does not mean that we all came from one person.
No,
I would say that. Yeah, that's not the take-home message of that. But it does. But that is what they're tracking. So I have a son. He's not going to have my mitochondrial. Sadly, I have he's not going to have my mitochondrial DNA, for example. But it sort of peters out.
Somewhere back there, yeah.
Right. But so it's tracking back. But it's not, the implication does not follow that we all came from one person. Yeah.
I was wondering if you all would discuss the argument of irreducible complexity that you sometimes hear. Like particularly, I don't know if you want to use the human eye as talk about that or.
Yeah, the idea of irreducible complexity is that how could something so complex evolve because the intermediate forms might not be useful? But in fact, what scientists have shown is that all of those steps, all those intermediate steps, are actually useful in those organisms that have them. And so the argument is just completely mute in that, more primitive eyes are also functional and useful for that organism in telling, maybe not seeing like we see, but certainly telling light from dark, for example. So it's just another one of those sort of arguments that are thrown out there with no real scientific basis.
That's a very old argument, actually, too. Louis Agassiz and like around 1900 making a similar argument, and so it's been around for a long time. And I actually went to somebody who was giving an ICR guy giving a talk using this strategy, this rhetoric. And essentially what it is like to look at something and think of it and see how complex it is and then stop. Almost to say like, look at how complicated this is. And so we're done. You know, and it's kind of like there, it's evidence of something that's very complex behind it, which is true, but they're attributing it to something that is not evolutionary, but theistic. But it's been around a long time, and it continues to surface because it's easy enough to look at something complex and say we can't explain it. And that's the strategy, really. I mean, is that as best I understand it? But
The example I always used to go back to feathers in flight, actually. When you think of feathers in flight, are you any of you birders? I'm a birder, I like to watch them. Well, you go watch birds. It's nice to watch them fly, but I presume one of the reasons you like to watch them fly, watch birds, is they're really pretty, right? I work in Guatemala. They have this bird called the resplendent quetzal, which has like this 3-foot emerald green tail. Well, that's a thing that those feathers are doing. That was something in earlier adaptation that had nothing to do. You don't have to have a 3-foot tail to be an effective flying, right? And so birds can keep warm in part because of their feathers. You know, there's a lot of other functions that something have in these intermediate stages. And so that's one example that sort of falsifies this idea. If you look at the whole chicken, it's kind of hard to explain it. But if you step back from it, you can come up with a couple other explanations that may have led to some of these things.
I think the basics of that too is if you don't accept geologic time, right, and if you don't have a clear understanding of the immensity of what scientists are thinking of the geologic time available, then none of it makes sense.
We named the chicken.
There's not much to look at.
No. What's the chicken? What do we think of as chicken?
From Southeast
Came from
Asia.
some Southeast Asian, which doesn't look like a chicken.
That's true.
It wouldn't sell well because it has no breast meat, and, doesn't lay an egg, but when it wants to and all that. So we named the chicken that everybody thinks about as chicken.
They've evolved along with humans. That's true.
It wouldn't exist without us, right?
That's true.
And they don't live very long. They don't make it.
If you saw some of the chickens in the Purdue houses right now, they're falling over because they've been working at such large breast meat. That's not intelligence.
And the
Right.
turkeys are that way too.
Yeah.
They start breaking their legs after about 2 weeks if they're not harvested. They eat so much, and they don't need legs. We sell the Chinese. Their legs will start breaking, because their undercarriage hasn't been bred enough to keep all of the fat
That
turkey.
proves that artificial selection can be grim.
But you can eat it.
That's true. You can eat it. It's tasty but grim.
Closer to turkey breast than intestine.
That's true. That's
Another question?
We've got Joseph up here. Scientific creationism, intelligent design.
Would you like to discuss why all of a sudden Neanderthals are so popular? There was a big article in this week's Wall Street Journal about what you were saying about finding flower remains in the graves, and of course they brought up the Jurassic Park thing. Can we make one? Should we make one? What's all this about?
Actually, there's a reason that I think this has been the case lately. Neanderthals, there's always the basic question, are they like us or are they not like us? And this is, there's this famous, actually this was my dissertation advisor. He wrote an article called Reaganomics and the Fate of Progressive Neanderthals. And what he tracked in this article is he said, in very conservative political times within the country, we view Neanderthals as being not similar to us, to being completely different species. In very liberal times, we're much more likely to think of Neanderthals as very similar to us. Like if you shave them and put them in a suit, you could sit next to them on the subway and it would not be remarkable. And so this is the idea. And so I think, I've wondered, because what you've seen over the past, we were going through, 1980s, 90s really, in 2000, a pretty conservative time, U.S. history, politically speaking, that may be shifting a little bit now. I actually wondered if people are starting to think about that in public imagination, about how we perceive Neanderthals, you know what I mean? So that's my unscientific explanation, but there is some basis in that. There's how the perception of our, these relatives, and so that may play into that. I like the story, so I'm saying.
Just to keep things going. Since we did have, people in Europe have bits of Neanderthal DNA, could you start back breeding Europeans, primary colors?
This was a question,
And back
actually.
breed them to Neanderthal?
There's a guy that was on the Colbert Report. He said, could we clone a Neanderthal? And he says, if there was some idiot with enough money, you could try to do something like that, but it almost certainly would not be able to do that. I mean,
It'd be slow.
it would be slow.
It would be.
Yeah.
Well, I think,
Well,
yeah.
I'm not talking about slow or anything, but could you, over time? We're talking about sending people to Mars or, out of 50 years they won't even come back.
I think the problem is that we've had so much mutation happen since then, that the odds of actually getting somebody who's 100% Neanderthal would be nearly impossible. Because you're always gonna have some remnant, you're always gonna have some mutation that's passed on, and so I think it'd be very difficult. I mean, I suppose theoretically, yeah, it could be possible, but
We don't care what the genetics say as long as they look like it.
Yeah,
This is Jurassic Park. We're doing that.
But when you look at, you have the American buffalo, the bison, and our typical cow, Bos taurus, and you can get you can breed them, you get a beef of them. And there's been some problems with that, and I'm told that they've been able to, in that group, breed out a cow back to a, quote, purebred bison. So if that's true, really true, then in theory, one can do that.
But
They might become politicians or something like that.
That's genetic change. One of them, I just.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, with that cloning issue going on, I was just reading recently, and I don't know if this is true. The Japanese were trying to clone a mammoth. They had the recent
That's Suzuki who's trying to do that. Yeah.
DNA, that wonderfully preserved little baby
Right.
mammoth.
We started that, I was with a group that started that back in the 80s. We were finding frozen juvenile mammoths in Siberia. And we couldn't really work on it there because back then it was still Soviet Union. And we were able to ship it to Takatazuka, Japan. And Suzuki, Dr. Suzuki was the one really trying to spearhead. Could we actually get that material, do a Jurassic Park, create a new mammoth? And in each case, it's never complete enough, to be able to do that. You still hear reports, usually it's from Discovery Channel, that says, yeah, we can approach that. I'll be curious to see if that ever happens. I feel sorry for whatever pops out.
yeah, it's probably just gonna be some percentage. I mean, the way that the analogy I like to use is it's like you're trying to recreate a phone book and you don't have all the pages.
Yeah.
If you don't have them all, you can't recreate it. Probably the only example of a quote Jurassic Park that we'll get, at least in our lifetime, is in Australia. They've been able to extract thylacine DNA, and they actually have been able to get that DNA to replicate. But it's a complete code. They have the whole sequence.
And what's thylacine?
Thylacine is the Tasmanian tiger. It's extinct. It went extinct in the 1930s. The last one died in a zoo, and that's probably something that we will see cloned in our lifetime. But even then, they have to take that DNA and put it into an egg of another organism. So it's still not going to be 100% thylacine. It's going to be close, but not 100%. But that's probably something that will happen in our lifetime. I mean, the last time I saw a timeline, they said, well, we'll have it done by 2010. Well, needless to say that's probably within the next decade.
Well,
As
that's
far as humans go, is there any, I'm reading about gene transplants or finding a defective gene and then doing transplanting or converting that into quote a healthy gene or taking a characteristic. I know they do that in vegetables or something, or tomatoes or strawberries. Is any of that going on now in the human?
Yeah, I think people are moving towards this idea of individualized medicine. It's fraught with a lot of ethical problems, operational problems, and economic problems. That's what I'm going to say, because it's something that cannot be scaled up. I mean, for specific things, almost by definition, individualized medicine. You can't simply technology. You know what I mean? What I mean by that is you can't have Prilosec or whatever the next mega drug is. It's going to make billions of dollars a year, and so there's not the same economic incentive to pursue that, and so that's one thing that's sort of slowed down. There's a whole host of things that are problematic with that, but yeah, I think that's something. I know people are interested in individualized medicine, and that's one form of that. There's a lot of other
got kind of fuzzy in there. But I was wondering about like evolution being just tied to like what you eat and what eats you, pretty much. And you know, if like going to a place where whatever you are survives better.
So survival of the fittest, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah, well, I mean, because like, you know, cloning these things that were in the times of the Neanderthals or whatever, it's like, okay, well, we don't have those genes. If that could eat us, then why are we trying to like, see if we can bring it back to life?
Right, there are ethical implications. Yeah, that's definitely true. And you can actually see something analogous to that, like when you have like, I don't know why my wife was interested in this, but did you fall into the Everglades now? They have like this snake hunting?
Yeah.
What was the
Yeah.
snake? It was a
Burmese
particular python down in Everglades. And they were basically bringing, everybody who had a gun who wanted to go shoot one of these, they were encouraging like to pass them on. My wife was really interested in this. I don't know why.
Did she go?
No, she was just tracking and all that. Yeah, you know, that would have been a good story. But anyway, no.
Nice big
But the point is, it's there and it's eating everything, and it's like this. You inserted this predator that's able to eat all this stuff. It's really causing havoc now, and so that's not entirely fanciful. That if you drop something in at the top of the food chain, you can have some really problematic downstream ecological consequences. So that there are certain that's totally rational. There's some ethical
The same thing has happened over and over again in Australia, actually, where they've introduced something like a cat or a fox.
Or
and
cane
the
toad.
What's that?
Or the cane toad.
Yeah, like, you know, and the animals that are native there, you know, they're just kind of like, hey, cool, there's a fox, what is that? I'm gonna go over and see what it is. Gobble, 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 you know. So they haven't co-evolved, so they don't recognize them as a potential threat.
Has that ever worked when, like, scientists,
It's
like,
usually not
introduce?
science.
It's not
Well,
science.
no, or a naturalist or whatever, like, reintroduces, like, the wolves into the, you know, like the Smokies or whatever, you know?
Now that's different, because there you're talking about bringing something back that was there.
were native.
Well, I know, but there weren't so many people there. Who runs faster, a deer or a Boy Scout?
Well, and that's the issue. That's the ethical issue, is do we bring something back that was extinct and would kill us, right? And
Right.
most people don't want that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, most people don't want it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad for the environment. I
Paul
mean,
Martin brought in that rewilding of North America, and he was pushing, along with a couple other naturalists, about reintroducing certain predators to North America that died out, say, about 10,000 years ago. So certainly the wolf, we had a lion that was kind of similar to, the African lion. So can we rewild North America? And I think a lot of people aren't real happy with that idea. You know, you want to go for a walk without getting eaten.
That's good, Rick.
You have a lot of 5-year-olds.
Kate has a question. I'm a literature professor, and I worry about seeing character evolves in the classroom because it's, people don't like that. And you're more on the front lines. Is it becoming more acceptable? Is it easier to teach after 150 years, or do you have a timeline? Like in 2,000 years, people will all believe it, or?
It's just, I think it's just as controversial. It just depends on the audience.
Well, and some of my other studies are on things of like paranormal belief, and frankly, it can be maintained easily enough. I mean, you just need a group of people to buy into it and keep it going. So, I mean, I think it might get lessened as the evidence accumulates. You might sort of see the proportion dwindle, but I think there will still be a committed core who still have those doubts that can be raised. Because you can be skeptical of anything. I mean, and disbelieve. It's easy enough to sit and disbelieve.
There is actually a flat earther group out there too.
Is there? I didn't know if there was.
Yeah.
Geocentrism.
Yeah.
I got a mailing that was showing a diagram of geocentrism.
So it goes all the way back up.
They don't travel
Yeah.
In my classes, I don't ever have problems, frankly, because my classes, the only people who are signing up are automatically willing to engage. I don't know if that's
Self-selecting.
Yeah, I do. We do. We actually usually end up having 1 or 2 students drop because of problems with what they're being taught.
We've actually had, in human history, had periods where there was an intellectual buildup, we're a small group like Greece, or whatever times, you know, where there's, you know, intellectually, we're still living off Greek thought in a lot of ways, you know, a lot of the stuff we do. We're the Greeks, you know. History overpowers, there could be, who knows what's gonna happen? There could be a new religion come out of somewhere, totally obliterates all thought, Western thought.
That'd be interesting.
I'd be very
No,
interested.
no, everybody could, because you go ahead and, you know, muscles.
Yeah.
Question back here.
Speaking of people who don't believe English.
I think a lot of the problem is what Dr. Baker alluded to in this talk earlier, is that there's this 15%, right? And then half of that 15% are diehards on either side. Like, I'm a person of faith, but I totally, I completely embrace evolution. My definition of science is empiricism. Science is about observational stuff. I'm a physician by trade. And, you know, it's all about what you can see and what you can observe. And I think that people polarize, like many, many other issues in our culture, people polarize this to a ridiculous degree. And so, you know, I think, I guess I think that, you know, science can't say anything about the spiritual realm. And I also find it very objectionable, like the Institute for Creation Research people, it's just like, this isn't science. You can call it, you know, science is about, you know, like Darwin's theory predicts intermediate forms. We find intermediate forms. There's no predictability potential in saying, okay, the Earth is 6,000 years old, and God, it's old. It looks old, but it's really young. You know, he's trying to fool us or something. You know, so I guess what I would like to take away in my life is just from that polarization thing, and I think there are really strident voices in the evolutionist side saying that a belief in evolution mandates atheism. I don't believe that, and I also don't believe that I have to, you know, I'm raising and educating our daughter. I was like, do I really have to tell her that the Earth was made in 24-hour days? I mean, you know, like, I was just like, what? You know, so it just, to me, that they're compatible and enriching, mutually enriching, and it's a matter of perspective from my point of view. Like,
I think more people take that view than not. The tension is that being polarized is more compelling media.
yeah, it's that microphone.
It is, you know, and if, you know, again, if you want to see Bill O'Reilly debate an atheist, it's entertaining.
Right.
You know what I mean? But if you would like to hear a liberal theologian talk about the compatibility of religion and science, you know,
Goes on.
yeah, right. But so I think it is. There's more people in the middle, but you just hear more about the conflict because it has more inherent marketability.
Yeah. Well, I think you really sort of hit a good point there too. That, you know, science and religion are two very different things, and they have two very different purposes.
Right.
And so, I mean, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. You know, we all belong, or most of us belong to the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, and we have an annual meeting every year. And you go to this meeting, and you'll be surprised at how many vertebrate paleontologists actually are religious. You know, they don't see, they're two very different things, and so they don't have to be mutually exclusive. And so it's surprising to a lot of people that are creationists when I tell them that. They think, really, you can be a paleontologist and religious? Yeah, we don't see a problem with it, because they serve different purposes.
You can't be a fundamentalist.
What's that? No.
Yeah.
The new atheists and the fundamentalists are essentially
Put
talking to each other past everyone else.
Yeah.
You know.
Maybe part of the issue is that it's more fun if we don't know everything. You know, some of you know who Ray Bradbury is, well-known science fiction writer. And, you know, Ray Bradbury in his early work was clearly concerned that rational thinking would do away with everything that's fun, with all of it. You know, someday we would ban all the books like Frankenstein because we'd rationally know that wasn't true. Sometimes I wonder if there's that undercurrent in all this stuff too, that it's fun to believe in UFOs, that sort of thing. And I know that sounds trivial, but apparently there is this concern that if everything becomes rational, then nothing's left that's mystery and nothing's fun. One day I told Blaine the greatest thing that's going to happen is when we dig down the site and we found the crashed UFO. Then we really put this place on the map.
I think that's one thing that's true for a lot of scientists. I know for me that explaining something is not the same as explaining it away. It doesn't somehow rob it of its mystery, you know how it works. It doesn't make it somehow disenchanting to know, you know what I mean? That's not a problem, I think, for a lot of people from a scientific perspective. That's, at least for me, that's an important thing, I think, to remember.
I think it is arduous, though. It is time-consuming and difficult to really look into how things operate, and sure, it's in some sense easier just to believe that, aliens made pyramids. You know what I mean? Just to kind of like sit back and do it, and people do this all the time on History Channel or ancient shows. It's easier to accept things without pushing really hard to figure out what's really going on, and so there's an ease to it.
Yeah, but I think the thing is, though, that I disagree with is when you start pushing to try and figure out more about it, you actually learn how much more exciting it is and how much more you don't know. And so it opens the door to more questions rather than giving you all the answers.
But it assumes you're okay with ambiguity.
That's true.
And if you're not okay with ambiguity, yeah, it's
and
hard.
I think that's just a lot of the difference is just the way people are wired.
Well, I mean, is that the difference really between, you're talking about the social difference between people, there are people who have just gotta have it, like this, and other people say, it can be this, it can be that. Is that what you're really measuring when you're looking at conservatism versus liberalism and education and different levels of education?
In some part, like there's some moral psychologists who talk about different modes of thinking between those different positions. I don't think that's all that's going on, but there is some different sort of styles of thinking that occur between different positions. Now, that's not to say that every liberal is rational, you know what I mean? So if you look at like the New Age movement, that comes from a lot of liberal individuals, and so, I don't think I wouldn't say it's either or. I'm always hedging, you know what I mean? So I guess that puts me in the ambiguity category. Yeah. But no, there is something to that. There are different styles that are tendencies, but there's certainly not one-to-one that everybody who has a certain style becomes a certain type of individual. But something to it.
Will, you had a question?
I actually wanted to backpedal in the conversation back to when we were talking about bringing back animals that we might be able to get enough DNA for if we ever did. I was curious kind of on your guys' personal standpoints on if we were able to finally get enough DNA and breed a mammoth, even though, yes, that would be awesome and cool, I'm totally proponent for it. Scientifically, would it really be beneficial, do you guys think? Because it wouldn't really be a mammoth, it would be what we could get birthed from an elephant. Would it be close enough to even be worth it?
Yeah, if you're making the mammoth and there's a market,
What's beneficial? Nothing anything you guys do.
Have a giant barbecue. That
would be really interesting as far as our economic.
But
putting dollars and cents to a Republican congressman.
I would like to. Is it Will?
Yeah.
I'd love to respond to that. I'm a sociologist in the same department at ETSU as Dr. Baker, and speaking from a sociological perspective, elephants are social animals. Mammoths, I'm assuming, would also be social animals. And so then this idea of being able to bring back a specimen, a single individual, doesn't tell you about the social relationships among the animals in their group, which is also part of their evolution and survival. So it's limited information. I agree with you, it'd be pretty astonishing, but it would be like sociologists trying to predict, say, opinions in the United States based on only one individual. So.
Some people would say that actually the mammoth isn't extinct, but if you look at certain of the suite of characters, that the Asian elephant is just a bald, short, little mammoth. Usually when we think of mammoth, we think of the woolly mammoth of Siberia and tromping on Neanderthals and things like that. But some people would say it's basically its cousin, if you will, still around today through Asia. So I would wonder if we, if we were able to make a mammoth, which one did we make? If you want to reinvent the car, you don't want to go to Edsel. So you really want to watch out what you're remaking. And they'll probably, by getting the frozen ones, they'll probably get the more woolly mammoth. Well, that's fine. You don't get a big, shaggy, hairy mammoth, but where are you going to put it? So you don't want to. What Paul Martin wanted to do was rewild North America. So parts of Texas and Arizona and any good grassland would have this woolly mammoth, and it's probably going, God, I need a shave because I'm hot. There's real problems with that, but it sounds very romantic to me.
Sure. Actually, I want to pipe in real quick too. That we do have examples of animals that have been brought back in a sense, and they usually don't work. I mean, because they don't know how to behave. And the classic example that I like to use is the black-footed ferret. Basically was thought to be extinct in North America. And then in the 1980s, they found a population, about 150 individuals, and they started observing them, and the plague went through the population and killed almost all of them. And they went in and captured the final 18 animals, and only 7 of them were used to start breeding again. And now they're breeding black-footed ferrets like crazy. They have breeding facilities, several in the United States. And they try to reintroduce them to the wild, and they don't know how to be ferrets. They don't know what to do, because they're just from those couple individuals who've been raised in pens, and they don't know what to do. And so these animals, they don't survive. They try to put them out in the wild, they don't survive. And it was neat, I met a guy that worked at one of these facilities, and he was telling me that they were trying to train the ferrets to be scared of badgers. And so they basically took a stuffed badger and they put it on a remote control car and to drive this badger around trying to scare the ferrets. And they said they knew it was a problem when one day they turned on the car and the ferrets jumped on top of it. And started riding it around. And so that's probably not a good behavior in the wild. So even if we could bring one of these animals back from extinction, it would not be the same animal. It would not know how to behave. It would not have those learned behaviors. So it is definitely something to do. It is sort of a lesson in time, as we say.
I can say that's similar to the, is the California condor extinct or not extinct right now?
Yeah, I mean, in reality, that's an animal that, I hate to say this I'm very much in favor of conservation, but I think the California condor is something we should probably let go. Because in reality, it's probably a relic of the Pleistocene. When we had the Pleistocene megafauna living all over North America, it would have had lots of carcasses to eat, lots of things to scavenge on. Well, they're all gone now. And so it's just this relic that has managed to hang on. In reality, if we're going to put focus into money into saving an animal, that's probably not our best target because it's probably not going to make it. But I didn't say that. I know, I just thought about that. But I mean, you get my point though. We do have limited resources. We do only have so much money we can put into conservation. So it's something that we can say would probably be a better target.
It's expensive because they reintroduced them to the Grand Canyon area, actually just outside the Grand Canyon, and then once they're released, they take the air currents and end up in the Grand Canyon to repopulate that area where we know they occurred throughout the Pleistocene. And one of the problems is with black-footed ferret, they're really not totally sure how to get their own food. And so they're being taught how to scavenge, but there's not enough things in the canyon to scavenge. So there's a lot of roadkills and a lot of local cattle that get salvaged and then they get dumped in the canyon. They don't eat that, sort of thing. So there are some issues with it. There were some burrows that were introduced to the Grand Canyon back in the late 1800s, and the Park Service went through a series of things of, well, it's not native, let's get the burrows out of here. And I was saying, just leave them here and shoot them every so often, let them die, and the condors will love it. But it just wasn't part of the game plan of the politics. So now it's very expensive to keep the condors.
Did lead poisoning was killing them? So
it was originally because the condors were in California were eating a variety of dead birds that had lead shot in it. So that's why we're going to bismuth as the shot in many places.
You think so?
Huh?
You think so?
I'm just stating.
Yeah, the laws were changed about what they could shoot.
Yeah.
Allow lead.
Yeah.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up. Thanks, everybody, and we'll be here if you want to ask us more questions. Thank you.